Welcome to this presentation of my master's thesis, which was called Effective Volumetric Sculpting for Focus+Context Visualization, utilizing implicitly defined surfaces and VR on demand. My name is Marius Egens, and my supervisor was Helvig Hauser. So, when you want to visualize three-dimensional data or volumetric data, occlusion is often a problem. So volumetric data are data values, let's say in a three-dimensional array in a volume, right? And these values you can classify as different structures of your scanned object. So you could, for instance, classify high density values as the skeleton. And then you can say, tell your computer, I want to render only those values of said density value. And then you would get something like this. And skeleton is usually not very hard to visualize. It's easily classified by high density values. And also, it's usually not occluded by other data or other structures that have same or similar data values, density values. However, if you want to visualize the brain, for instance, then so the brain will usually share density values with other organic structures. For instance, the skin and muscles and tissue. And so when you try to render it, you might end up with something like this. So it's occluded by other structures of similar data values. You could, of course, lower the contributing opacity of each individual data point. And then this will make thin structures like skin, for instance, more transparent than something voluminous like the brain. However, there's still occlusion, and also you are locked into the rendering definition that makes the brain visible in the first place. So you can't change the opacity, for instance. You can't really start defining the data values you want to see. So the solution to this is to segment the brain spatially, and then to say, inside this segment, I want to visualize in one way, and outside, I want to visualize in a different way. For instance, you could say, I don't want to render anything outside the segment, and I only want to render inside the segment. So then you have this filtering. And now you can start to select how to render your brain any way you want without being worried about it being occluded. Also, this provides Focus+Context Visualization. So you could say, I want to render everything inside my segment in one way and everything outside my segment in a different way. So here I'm rendering the inside in a focused manner, and everything outside in a contextual manner using a contour style rendering. So segmenting your volume, you can do, of course, using automatic algorithms, but sometimes you need to use manual segment, or you need to define your segmentation manually. And this is what I have been focusing on. So manual segmentation through sculpting of segments. And when I think about sculpting segments, spatial segments, I immediately think of virtual reality. It sounds perfect because you can move your hand controller around in virtual space. And so it's a more immediate representation, right, of how you would sculpt in the real world. So I was thinking, how can we... So I wanted to utilize virtual reality, and then I thought, how can I best leverage VR, and how can I fit a VR workflow into a normal workflow, also leveraging for all the other peripherals, not just VR. So I'm using this term VR on demand. First of all, there's two other terms, standard space and virtual space, that I will be using. If I say standard space, I mean the normal environment where you have your mouse and keyboard and screen. While virtual space is this virtual environment that you enter when you put on your VR equipment, VR peripherals. And VR on demand means that the user can put on the VR headset, perform the actions that he needs to in virtual space, and then just take off the VR headset and continue in standard space. So this entering the virtual space should be voluntary. So you should not have any tools that are exclusive to VR. You should support short uses because people don't like to stay in virtual reality for extended periods. You should leave out anything that does not actually benefit from virtual space. And virtual space is on demand, not the standard space. So you can keep standard space as the main lobby that they will always come back to after being in virtual space. When it comes to segmentation, the most typical way of segmenting volumes is probably voxel-based segmentation. So you have, for instance, in this solution, you start with a fully selected volume, and then you subtract away by using these subtractive sculpting tools. But I was thinking, perhaps voxel-based segmentation is not optimal for an interaction scheme that utilizes all the peripherals. And I also thought, since it had been studied extensively, maybe it would be nice to try a different angle. So I'm using implicitly defined solids in my solution, which will allow you to sculpt piecewise using mathematically defined solids. So you have all your pieces available at any time, and you can modify them at any time using any peripheral. So for instance, you can use your GUI to visualize each piece and change attributes. You can use the keyboard to set exact values for a piece attribute. You can use the 3D view to interact with pieces directly using your mouse. You can use a slice view to visualize and perform more exact changes. You can use a virtual reality headset to view the sculpt and the individual pieces immersively. And you can use VR hand controllers to interact with the pieces immersively. And just so you understand what I mean, here is a short video of the segmentation scheme. So here I'm adding in pieces, mathematically defined pieces. So within this segment here, it is visualized using a focus style rendering, and outside is using a contextual style rendering. And so I add pieces, and so I build up the sculpt piecewise by adding in pieces. And then I can change the attributes of the piece. And I can also make it subtractive. So no, I first add in this piece, and then I can subtract away a bit of it. And so I can add a new piece. And so there I want to subtract away that part. So, and all these pieces they are here in the GUI for you if you need to access them, and all their attributes are visible. So that's what I call piecewise sculpting using geometrically defined solids. So to make this possible, I'm using sphere tracing. So in sphere tracing, you will have your defined sculpt, and then iteratively, it's an iterative approach. You need to query your sculpt for it the nearest surface and step along your viewing ray to get to the intersection. This intersection point, you need you will find it iteratively. So you step by the distance to the nearest surface each time, and then you step, and then when you reach a threshold of distance to the sculpt, it means you have intersected with the solid. And this is where sphere tracing usually ends. But what I am doing, because I need this segment also, so in my solution, I am just taking a tiny step into the solid, and then I'm doing the same sphere tracing algorithm until I hit the surface from the negative space, or I iterate towards it inside the negative space. And this works pretty well, actually. So then you have this, and you have this, or this segment and this segment. In my use case, I need, because there's often individual pieces of a sculpt in the scene, and I often need to find multiple consecutive segments of the sculpt. And so what I'm doing is just following the same procedure. I sphere trace until I hit my first entry point, take a tiny step in, sphere trace until I hit my exit point, and then I take a tiny step out, and then I just repeat until I hit my second exit point, and then I take a tiny step out and repeat until I hit my third exit point. And this you could continue doing as long as you want using a loop. In my use case, 3 is more than enough. Usually 2 is enough, but depending on your use case, you might want to continue this process. It depends on the opacity of your focus. Also, in my solution, I have this context, outer focus, and inner focus setup. So, with the outer focus being sort of a mix between context and focus. And to make this happen, first I sphere trace the context, the outer focus, and inner focus sculpts individually. And then I end up with these points. Then I take all of these points and I put them all into a list, and I order them front to back. And using this new list, ordered list, I can generate a list of ray segments ordered front to back, where one segment has the segment type and its entry and exit point. So from these points, you would get this list. So context, outer focus, inner focus, context, outer focus, and so on. And what you can do now is you can render front to back. So you can do direct volume rendering over this piece, and then direct volume rendering over this piece using an outer focus style, and then you add it in, you alpha blend it as you go, and then an inner focus direct volume rendering, and add it in, and so on. And this will support individual opacity for all of them, context, outer focus, and inner focus. You can use basically any segment-based rendering style you would like to, since you are direct volume rendering over segments. And also you can do early termination within a segment and also within the full loop. So when you're direct volume rendering over one segment, you can, if you hit maximum opacity, you can just stop and go to the next one. So that's the rendering part. When it comes to the sculpting, I'm using something I call meta boxes. and these are inspired by blobby objects, also called metaballs. So the metabox is basically just a combination of a rounded box and a smooth union subtraction operation. So with the rounded box, you can, by adjusting the roundness value, you can go from a box, perfect box, to a perfect sphere. And then you can also adjust the dimension in each axis of the box. So by, for instance, you can, by using roundness and extending it in one axis, you can get a cylinder shape. You could also have a elongated box without the roundness. And you could have something like a thick slice. And there's many simple shapes you can make with just this. And then when you combine this with the blending operation, just a few shapes will get you really complicated shapes. For instance, this one is only 4 pieces added and subtracted. And this would be very complicated to make using only polygons. And so I just want to show a short video of how you add them together. So it's an order, they are added together in order. First you add this, and then this, and then this, and then this. So every added box is put on the end of the list. And this last one, if this is subtracted now, it will subtract from all the boxes above it in the order. And then I can add in a new box into this subtracted space if it's added in below it here. And also you can group your meta boxes into groups, and then you can do group-wise editing. For instance, here I'm just turning on and off the group. And also, of course, the context crop should be cropping the focus scope as well. So here you can see by changing the dimensions of the crop, it also crops the focus. And this is basically just an intersection. So the focus scope is intersecting with the crop scope, or the crop shape is just one shape. And now I want to show a video of sculpting in VR, in virtual space. So here you can see you have access to all the same functions. You also have this 3D pointer, which when you add a new piece into your scene, it will be centered on the 3D cursor. And so you can make a piece subtractive. You have access to all the same attributes. You can scale it. And also you can rotate the scene using your right hand. And then you can be moving your meta boxes and the shapes around with your left hand. And this makes it a fast process. And so, yes. And this pointer you could use for presentational purposes as well. So now here I just want to show you how the interaction works. So you can see this axis. This is the axis you will be scaling along. And to select an axis, you just align your controllers with that axis. So here, and then to actually scale, you push your both triggers down and vary the distance between your hands. So here you can see I'm selecting this and this and this axis and just pulling it apart, sort of. And you can also adjust the other attributes with the same scheme. So you just hold your triggers and vary the distance between your hands. And there's a little widget showing how much roundness there is. And this is a widget showing the radius of the blend. So you can see here the blend starts at the edge of this widget, the blending between the two shapes. So that was the sculpting in VR. And then I just want to show some of the best results, some videos. And okay, so first of all, you have your occluded. So let's say you want to visualize something inside the head, in the brain, for instance, and you have this occluded head. So what you can do is you can select a contour style rendering for the context, and then your focus. So this is inside this segment. There, I'm using a classification based rendering. So I'm classifying these values or I'm classifying them and rendering them in white, and these values I'm classifying and rendering in red. And so now you can easily see inside. You can see so inside the head from any angle, and you can define the rendering inside your segment. Okay, so here I'm just showing the difference between the meta boxes and just plain boxes. So you could use just plain boxes to get a pretty good segmentation. So this is using only plain boxes, and then here is with the meta boxes. And you can see it has a better hug around the organic structure. And here, all this green is the noise. This is not part of this organic structure. So this is the noise that you will be cutting away by using the meta boxes. And this would you would have to use a lot of plain boxes with subtractive plain boxes to remove all that noise. So with the meta boxes, you don't need to do that. And here I'm showing the inner focus, outer focus thing. So within this inner focus, you can define the rendering style individually from the outer focus. And now you can lower the opacity of the outer focus. And now it is more like a blend of a context and focus. And this you can adjust however you want at any time. So this can be very helpful, for instance, in this circumstance. One really nice attribute of implicitly defined surfaces is that you can visualize them in slice view as well. So here, everything that is blue, rendered blue, is in the context. Everything that is rendered in orange is in the outer focus, and everything in purple is in the inner focus. And also, when you select the shape, you can also visualize the contour in slice view. And now you can interact with your pieces directly in slice view. So you can get a very exact placement of your sculpt. So it's nice if you need to really fine-tuned sculpting. Here I'm just showing the dual space sculpting. So let's say you are just working in your standard space and you need to do some sculpting in virtual space. You just put on your VR headset and start sculpting. And so this view you can broadcast to an audience, and also this view. So you could use both views. So you can broadcast from your virtual space if you want to do some presentation, for instance. And so I'm just performing my sculpting in here, and then when I'm done, I can go back here and if I need to, I can fine-tune the sculpt and start adjusting. I could go into slice view as well and do some fine-tuning. So you're really leveraging for all your peripherals with this this segmentation scheme. And finally, I just wanted to show that this doesn't only work for volumetric data. You can use this segmentation scheme with basically any data that is spatially defined. So here I'm just using normal point data, and I have these segments made, and now I can define the rendering of the points depending on which segment they're in. So I can make these blue points less opaque, and I can also use outer focus and inner focus in this scheme. And you can remove the points, you can filter them totally. And also one really interesting thing about this is you can use the point's distance from the surface of the sculpt as a visual channel. So here I'm just interpolating between context and outer focus style rendering of the points based on their distance from the surface, and this will change the distance. And now you can see you can easily visualize the most contained points in your sculpt. And so if this is something you would need, it could be a very helpful solution. And so for the evaluation part of my thesis, I had 2 evaluation sessions, one with a computer graphics expert and one with a human-computer interaction expert. And so the sessions were built up like this. First, there was an introduction, and then I had a live demo of the application, and then they had time to test the application themselves, hands-on, and then there was a questionnaire they had to fill out. And this questionnaire, it was based on a Likert scale scheme, so ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. I was mainly asking them about my solution's usefulness and efficiency, and so I defined these words for them in advance. I also felt that efficiency needs to be compared to something else, and I chose to compare with a voxel-based sculpting scheme. And in the introduction, I explained how a voxel-based sculpting scheme might work. So, for instance, you can brush voxels on a rough spatially. And so the results of the questionnaire, they both agreed that my method or my solution was useful, but they disagreed that it was efficient. And I can agree with that. A voxel-based scheme might be more efficient in some circumstances, or maybe even in most circumstances. When it comes to VR on demand, they both strongly agreed that immersive view on demand is useful, and they strongly agreed that sculpting in VR on demand is useful. They also strongly agreed that dual space sculpting is efficient, so that you can rough sculpt in virtual space and then fine-tune in standard space. They also strongly agreed that virtual to standard space broadcasting is useful. So in conclusion, as shown by the results, my solution will address the key issues. So you can selectively reveal occluded data. You can spatially segment and render data distinctively. And you can precisely define segments that closely conform to organic structures. When comparing to voxel-based, I think, first of all, implicitly defined surfaces will allow you to have this non-destructive piecewise sculpting. So you always have your pieces available for fine-tuning. And this will allow you to do dual space piecewise interaction. So you can rough sculpt in virtual space and then fine-tune in your standard space. And you can also fine-tune pieces in the slice view as well, right? And so you are leveraging for all your peripherals, I feel. I would argue simple exact sculpts are faster in my solution. So let's say you want to just have a sphere, perfect sphere and a box shape, and you want a little bit of blending between them. This is really fast using my solution. I think it would be a bit slower with a voxel-based solution. So, but voxels, I think the voxel-based solution is really good for fast brushing of arbitrary shapes. So, for instance, something like an artery going through the body would probably be much faster to brush select using a voxel-based scheme in VR, of course. So you just follow the artery using your hand controller. You can also use arbitrary brush shapes, of course, with voxel-based segmentation. And with the voxel-based solution, you can do orthographic projection selection. So you could, for instance, just draw a box on your screen, and this box would be projected into the space, and everything within this projection would be selected either on or off, right? So, in conclusion, I think these two solutions doesn't really compete so much. They more complement each other. So one solution would be better for some use cases, and the other would be better for other use cases. And ideally, you would have both. But depending on your use case, you might just want to implement one of them. When it comes to VR on demand, I think the benefits are, first of all, immersive view on demand and spatial interaction on demand. And then, I mean, you can have this data presence on demand. So imagine you are in virtual space and touching the data will give you some graphic feedback and haptic feedback and maybe some sound feedback. It will feel like you're actually touching the data, and this will give you a different view of the data, a different feel of the data. And I'm not saying this is a better way to view the data. It might actually be worsen your view of the data. But it's very interesting, and yeah, it's a very interesting concept. So of course you can do virtual to standard space broadcasting. So if you want to present from an immersive view, it's great. And also, you don't need to implement anything that is not actually beneficial in virtual space. So for instance, a GUI, you can just develop for the standard space, and then you don't need to implement it in your virtual space. And this is notoriously difficult, the VR GUI. So it's good to not have to implement it. And I also feel that VR as an extension appeals to a broader audience. So instead of changing people's workflow to be from their standard workflow, and suddenly they need to do a virtual reality workflow, you just add the virtual reality functionality on top of their already existing workflow. And then you don't need to force people to stay in VR, in virtual space for extended periods of time. So this is very good. I don't think most people like to do that. And most people like to do serious work in standard space. But I think most people would appreciate the added virtual reality functionality. So the drawback is, of course, increased design complexity. However, I would argue it might actually decrease your design complexity, because you don't need to implement. So if you are going to make something to utilize virtual reality, with VR on demand, you don't need to implement anything that doesn't actually benefit from virtual space. So for instance, you don't need to implement your GUI, and making a GUI for standard space is much easier. So there's some things you don't need to implement in virtual reality that is much easier to implement in standard space. So I think it might actually decrease your design complexity. So with that, I think maybe there's no drawbacks at all with VR on demand. Thank you.